Have you ever felt afraid of both being too close, but also afraid of being too distant in a relationship? Well, if that sounds like you may be a fearful avoidant attachment style. And in this video, we're actually going to talk about the fearful avoidant attachment style and some of their needs while dating an anxious preoccupied style. Because as you'll see from the series of videos we're creating about the different attachment styles and their different attachment style pairings with one another, fearful avoidance and anxious preoccupieds tend to react and have really unique triggers, wounds, but also unique strengths to their relationship. So, one of the things that becomes very evident quite early on in this relationship is that while both of them may very much click in the early stages, the fearful avoidant eventually ends up fearing losing the relationship to themselves. Fearful avoidants tend to think in a very black and white type of thinking patterns or all or nothing type of thinking patterns. These are known as cognitive distortions. And from this perspective, what you will frequently see is that fearful avoidants tend to think that they can either have a relationship to somebody else or maintain the relationship to themselves, but it's either or. They tend to essentially think of these things as being mutually exclusive. And so what happens is because anxious preoccupieds tend to easily end up in codependent or enmeshed relationships, and because fearful avoidants also have the same proclivity, what you'll see is over time, fearful avoidants get afraid of losing completely the relationship to themselves. And so when we move from this sort of dating honeymoon stage in those sort of early stages of dating and into the more serious stages, what we'll end up seeing is the fearful avoidant starting to withdraw. And it can be really confusing for the anxious preoccupied person because they'll generally start off feeling like the fearful avoidant partner is very present, is very emotionally available. And then all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, that can start to shift and change. And so we're going to talk in this video specifically about the fearful avoidance needs from their AP partner, but I will also have follow-up videos about what the AP needs from their fearful avoidant partner, as well as videos on how to communicate these needs as well. This is all going to be part of a series. So what you'll see is the fearful avoidant, essentially one of their early needs is to have some sort of validation from their AP partner that it's okay for them to need time to themselves or need to have their own space or freedom. Because fearful avoidants often grow up in enmeshed households, or at least households where there's some form of codependency, they can really easily slip back into relationships of codependency. But what you'll see as a result of that is that when a fearful avoidant is in a codependent space, their form of codependency is to give, but not know how to receive. They generally have huge receiving blocks. So the fearful avoidance form of codependency is essentially a recipe for burnout. They think they're supposed to just give everything that they can. And then as soon as somebody tries to give back to them, and of course, we know that anxious preoccupieds can be very like generous and caring and giving in relationships, fearful avoidance will generally block this. They'll feel unworthy or they'll reject or deflect the anxious preoccupied's partner's attempt to give to them. So, what fearful avoidants need is this first understanding that they can actually have their own space and time. It doesn't have to be something that's the foundation of the relationship, but just knowing that there's time that the fearful avoidant can kind of go do their own thing, whether it's one night of the weekend that they spend time with friends or family, or one afternoon of the weekend where they really just get time to themselves. This tends to go a very, very long way. They also tend to need, because fearful avoidants have such high expectations of themselves in a relationship with others, they can put all of this pressure on themselves to show up in the best way possible. But sometimes they can also, as a byproduct of that, get very triggered if somebody else has high expectations of them. A big part of the reasoning behind this is that it's their shadow, right? The things that we do to ourselves that hurt us tend to be the things that trigger us very much when other people also mirror them back to us. And so what you'll see is the fearful avoidant when they're giving to a relationship, and then the AP is needing more time together or having more expectations, it can actually be something that really triggers the fearful avoidant into thinking like, okay, you're not even seeing how hard I'm trying. And, I just need to sort of withdraw because your expectations are too high. And so it's really important for the AP in this relationship dynamic to also try to learn to maintain the relationship to themselves. If I had to say something sort of in a point blank way, I would actually say it's going to be very important for both an anxious, preoccupied, and fearful avoidant to work on their codependent dynamics in this relationship in order for it to survive. Because codependency, although it seems romantic and idealistic in a sense of like, oh, I'm just going to meet all of your needs and you're just going to meet all of mine. Relationships actually don't work like that. When we assume that one another are just responsible for each other's needs rather than having a degree of responsibility for our own needs as individuals, and also having this reciprocal exchange of needs, in a relationship, but it being, somebody's empowered in both sides of that, not it being that somebody's really good at meeting the other person's needs, but doesn't know how to meet their own, and they're in this space of learned helplessness. What ends up taking place is a fearful when dating an anxious, preoccupied partner, can get into a place where they both, from this codependent manner, expect one another to meet each other's needs at all times. And it can actually create a lot of poison, because if we're not being able to account for what our needs are, we can't communicate them to each other. And as soon as one person misreads or misunderstands another person's needs, while the other individual in the relationship is trying so hard all the time to meet them, one person's going to feel unloved or unseen, or like they don't matter, because they're not able to advocate for what their need is. And so it will just create an enormous amount of expectation, eventually resentment when things go missed or left unsaid. And really, when we're in a codependent relationship with another person, we're really outsourcing our needs. And so there can just be this sort of dynamic of feeling really, really stuck in our ability to communicate. Like, we can find in these relationships that people really won't grow their communication skills. So there's going to be a really important dynamic here where both individuals learn to know their own needs, meet them in the relationship to themselves, and then also communicate them to others, rather than just expecting that the other person meet them without any form of communication. Another really big thing that the fearful avoidant will tend to need is they'll need to feel like they can have space to explore, and feel as though they still have their freedom maintained in this relationship dynamic. I've often seen in this relationship dynamic the anxious preoccupied's fear being so large or intense around a fearful avoidant exploring, thinking things like, if the fearful avoidant goes out with their friends, or spends time doing something that's their own hobby, or having time to themselves, often the anxious preoccupied person can make that mean, well, they're going to find somebody else or somebody better, and they're going to sort of leave the relationship, or that fear of abandonment can really come up. But the reality is that for a fearful avoidant, it's part of their personality to be like that. And whether the anxious preoccupied person is giving that space to them will often have a big determinant effect on like how much the fearful avoidant feels like they can be themselves in a relationship and be accepted and be received by their partner. So I know it can feel scary if you are the anxious preoccupied person listening to this, but that's a really good time to work through different core wounds that may come up, work through communication. You can still ask for reassurance from your fearful avoidant partner, while you're honoring their need to explore or have their own hobbies or interests. But it's something that if you find yourself in a position where you kind of clamp down on, or you accidentally kind of bulldoze a little bit of their boundaries or needs to have that, or even like kind of criticize about it, over time it will be something that the fearful avoidant kind of tends to really hold resentment around. And usually what will be the output long term is they'll actually push somebody further and further away. And again, that's the fearful avoidance piece to work on too, right? Because the fearful avoidant should be being able to communicate their needs and their boundaries and to honor these different things. But both parts can sort of become aware of this, and it can really help extend the relationship. I will say as well that we do have a 14-day free trial to a fearful, avoidant, anxious, preoccupied course that I'll put in the link down below. It's actually the course of like both sides of the relationship, how the FA feels, the AP, what they can each work on, what their needs are, how to communicate those needs, all sorts of information in that course. And it's definitely something you can get through in less than 14 days in its entirety. So I will put that link down below if you want to check it out. We'll just have it there for a limited time. And going on to some other needs, fearful avoidance will often need this absence of pressure and expectation from their partner. And again, when you hear, let's say you're an anxious preoccupied listening to this, when you hear this idea of the absence of pressure and expectation, it doesn't mean that you can't communicate what you need to your partner. It means how you communicate will matter. So you don't have to, um, you know, withhold that you have any needs from your partner. But if you say, hey, we're not spending enough time together, you're not making an effort enough, and you're sort of framing it in that negative way, instead of reframing it and saying, hey, I really value our relationship, I'd love to spend some quality time on the weekend. Can we go for dinner? If you're framing it in a positive way, things you're excited about, things you appreciate about your partner, that is much more likely to land and be heard and understood. And if instead, for example, your fearful avoidant partner says something back to you like, yeah, I can spend time on Friday, but Saturday I'm going to spend time with friends. You want to be able to, again, not repress your own needs. And again, we'll be talking about anxious preoccupied needs in a separate video, but you don't have to just, be quiet and sort of clam up around anything related to your needs, you can, honor and support that that person wants to spend time doing something different, but also say, can you give me a call before bed so we can chat? Or just something that allows you to have that reassurance and that certainty, but while still honoring that person's needs. And so then we get this exchange of both people being able to have their sides, their feelings, their needs honored and also communicated about, which again is such an important dynamic in this relationship to be improved upon, right? Because we can easily fall into those codependent traps again, where there's an absence of communication and everything's just kind of filtered through this idea of expectations of how we should show up without articulating what it is that we actually need. And the last couple of things is fearful avoidants generally need a little bit of challenge in their relationships. Often anxious preoccupieds can be so sweet and so kind and so generous and so, people pleasing. And fearful avoidants tend to need support, but they also tend to need challenge because they tend to be quite growth oriented at the end of the day. And also, a lot of the fearful avoidance subconscious comfort zone is around chaos. That's often their upbringing, their childhood. While that is something that a fearful avoidant absolutely needs to work on and heal, they will still tend to crave things that will create growth. So there's an old quote that says, optimal growth tends to occur at the border between support and challenge. And fearful avoidants will quickly tend to feel like things are falling flat if they don't have this degree of both. They want to feel that support, but they also want to feel challenged by their partner. And that can include things like somebody having a difference of opinion. That can include things like somebody having a different set of needs, hashing those things out, talking those things through. But if you find as the anxious preoccupied that you're constantly in a space where you're always people pleasing, always saying yes, always repressing yourself, not only will that be its own form of self abandonment and hurt you, but it also won't be beneficial to your relationship with your partner. So it's sort of a win-win to learn to advocate for yourself, to back yourself, to have your own opinions, your own needs, and to share your own truth in this relationship. And the very last thing I will say is that fearful avoidance may at times need breaks from constant communication. They may be really available sometimes, but often when fearful avoidants stretch themselves too thin, they kind of withdraw a little bit. While again, that's something the fearful avoidant should also be working on. The AP partner, if they get criticized for that, usually the fearful avoidant will then feel guilty and then withdraw even further. So instead, it can be really valuable to have conversations about like frequency of checking in, sort of have standards established in the relationship, but also allow for some degree of flexibility in that as well. So that is it for today. If you have more questions about this, please let me know in the comments down below. If you want to see more content about the fearful avoidant and anxious preoccupied relationship, please hit the like button. And if you're enjoying this channel, please consider subscribing as we put out frequent videos throughout the week to help educate you on all the different attachment style dynamics and how to heal. Thank you so much for watching.